Good evening, morning, afternoon, good day. I can see quite a few familiar faces there, also a few new ones. So I think we have the world in front of us, which is a blessing. Thank you all for joining us today. In the coming give or take 45 minutes, Martin, Carafa, and myself will walk you through our webinar on cross-cultural marketing. Might be some things you already know, might also be many things that you didn't know, and probably many more things that you didn't know you didn't know. So let's see what comes your way in the coming 45 minutes. The session will be recorded. The slides will also be shared with you together with that recording. So post this webinar, keep an eye out for your mailbox for that sharing to happen. On that note, let's kick off. Quick introduction on behalf of myself, Egbert Schram, Group CEO at The Culture Factor. Have been active in the culture space for the last give or take 2 decades, and in my function as a CEO, obviously also impacted by how culture influences topics such as marketing, branding, and communication in a broader sense. I will not be the main expert talking here today because that honor belongs to Martin Carafa. Over the past few decades, Martin has lived across the globe, has worked in even many more countries than he has lived in. And as you can see in his long career as a global planning director, he has worked for a list of selected agencies and an even bigger list of global clients, many of which you will know, many of the campaigns of which you will have seen in daily life. So straight from the source, you could call today's webinar. Marty will pick it up from me in about 10 minutes from now. So for the first 10 minutes at most, you will have to do with a short introduction on my behalf into the topic. The Culture Factor has been working across the globe with massive companies and also smaller companies since 1985 under various brands. So also we as an organization have changed brands in order to better represent that what we want to do. And under the Culture Factor, that what we want to do is to help our customers and their customers become more aware and become more proactive in understanding how to use culture as a source for making a bigger impact. And you can see the whole list of organizations that have used this body of knowledge and the tools in their day-to-day activities. As an organization, we use different behavioral models to unlock culture from multiple angles. And if we talk specifically about, in this case, let's say cross-cultural marketing teams, you have an element of national culture which influences the team's way of working. You have the corporate culture of the organization or the agency that the team works in. And what we're going to open up for you today, you have specific consumer cultures across the globe, which will help you to make much more impactful, effective, and efficient campaigns for your customers and or your organization if you work in-house. Different models to sometimes tackle the same challenge, just from different angles, and sometimes tackle specific problems. That is basically what makes us at the Culture Factor unique. Now, today we are going to mainly focus on that CCI or consumer culture intelligence angle. If you think about culture and how marketeers normally relate to this topic, the question begs, do marketeers perhaps fear cultural diversity? Is it the reason why many campaigns are run centrally? One message fits all, but is that really the case? Is it such that marketeers find culture unpredictable when they go beyond the mere mention of the word culture? Is it that they feel that by giving space to culture in a more localized format by really understanding your target audiences and what makes them basically consider buying and actually buying? Is it that corporate marketeers fear a lack of synergy? Is there fear of budgets running wild and losing control over what it is that they deem to be important? In other words, is culture a bugbear for marketeers? Is that why it isn't discovered and explored further? A lot of us might have heard this myth of the global village. We all become one because we all use LinkedIn, do we? We all use Facebook, or we used to. But is it really such that we become more similar, or is it simply that we are using more of the same, but with different mindsets? And is it that understanding these different mindsets can really help us to unlock bigger success, faster success? And that is what Marty is going to take us through in today's journey. What is the global village? Is there a global village? How do modern media impact these different perceptions? Do things like influencers work? And if they work, why do they work? Culture in today's world is becoming, I would argue, more important than ever, because whenever we feel similar to others, that is when the differences hit us the hardest. Now, a quick test on this, and I'm just going to ask you to put your answer in the chat to get a bit of live interaction, is I'm going to give you two countries, and I'm going to ask you to think about which country might we be describing. So for some of us, it could be considered it's always in a hurry. It's serious, it's reserved, it's very methodical. So country A, which country do we feel that could be? Please put your answer in the chat. And then while thinking about this, there's also country B. And country B is relaxed, it's very spontaneous, it's impulsive. And also there, I'm going to ask you, just put in the chat, which country might that be? And let's have a look what comes up in the chat. So country A, Germany or Japan. Country B, Brazil. Country A, South Korea. A lot of Germany, a lot of Roman cultures, Italy, Spain. Are we thinking in stereotypes, people? I hope not. What is it? It's actually the US. It's just a matter of perspective. Because from country A's perspective, in this case, the Mexican perspective, the US or the US culture is always in a hurry. But if we look at the US from Japanese perspective, the US is actually quite relaxed. So an important lesson to already take away from tonight, for those of you that haven't seen this before, is that culture is relative. It always depends from which angle are we looking at something. Now, another example from a marketing perspective, if we take the brand of Chevrolet, if we take the Mexican perspective, in Mexico, Chevrolet is the second place in terms of market share. Before the COVID pandemic, it grew 37% per year. If we take Japan, in Japan, it actually was in decline. So could it be that the American way of marketing Chevrolet actually fits quite well in the Mexican culture, but doesn't at all fit in Japan? And if we follow numbers, wouldn't that also build the case to tailor our approach to entering or servicing particular markets to make sure that we actually are successful and don't do one copy that fits the entire world? Because hopefully after today, you'll realize there ain't such a thing. So culture from a, call it, strategic management perspective should actually be considered the econometrics of emotion. It is making emotions measurable. And I'm pretty sure you all agree with the statement that if you can measure it, you can influence it. So when we talk about a shared emotional preference, we talk about a culture. And we can map culture not just at a national level, but also at a regional level, at an ethnic level, at a gender identity level, at any different type of level that you need for your brand or your market or your sales. Different groups appear. And by making it measurable, you can manage these groups better. So if you think about this from a cultural management perspective, culture explains how people with similar emotional preferences make sense of the world and interact. And from a sales and marketing perspective, it will inform you what will make people consider buying your product, number one. But number two, perhaps even more importantly, not just consider, but actually buy your product. And on that note, I'd like to close with the statement that culture can be quantified, because that is what we do at the Culture Factor day in, day out. And Martin is now going to show you and walk you through a few examples of how exactly this can be done and how it has been done. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Egbert. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up the screen from you and continue on the theme that you raised. So if culture can be quantified, that is, we can measure how different cultures, that is, people with different emotional preferences, differ from each other, and how many of them do that, and how strongly it is. What I'm going to do now is take you through two of the ways that we measure culture, two of the things that, yeah, there are emotional preferences that you can see how they'd be different across the world and certainly across generations, genders, or any other subcultures. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is, because this is a really important one, we call it perfectionism. And you can see how there's an emotional preference either way. There's, some what we'll call co-emotionalists who say, yeah, perfect, that's a little bit too hard. At the other end of the spectrum, we call them gratifiers, by the way, short-term gratifiers. On the other end of the spectrum, there are people or groups of people who say, yeah, you should always try to move a little bit closer to perfection. You don't have to have immediate gratification, right? I'd prefer to wait for something to be, or take some trouble for something to be really good as opposed to getting it now. So fast gratifiers or better, which do you prefer? We can see a list of countries here that we're going to be referring to, and I'm going to particularly refer to boomer generations in the USA. Brazil is a very strong gratifier culture. Germany, Finland, and Japan, the most perfectionist culture on the planet. And below, in each of these slides, I'm going to show where the generations in the UK differ. And so this is one of the major trends across the world, and the UK is no exception. One of the major trends across the world is that younger generations are not so impulsive, not so obsessed with having it now, immediate gratification, which goes against stereotypes. But let's just think about how these groups interact. Somebody says, here's my brand. If we're in an optimizer culture, it's like, yeah, I like it because it's constantly improving. It's constantly changing. On the other hand, I like it, don't mess with it. Why are they always changing things is what a gratifier culture says. Let's think about Starbucks. Let's go to Starbucks. Interesting, because those in our optimizer cultures say, yeah, great idea. Those in gratifier cultures go, yeah, maybe not so much. That might be surprising to us all because we say, oh no, Starbucks is fast coffee, right? But at the same time, what is it that distinguishes Starbucks from some of its so-called fast coffee competitors? And that is, yes, I can go in and I can order it with half calf, full caffeinated. I can have double espresso. I can have skinny milk. I can have low fat milk, and I have full fat milk. I can do that. And you absolutely you absolutely have the ultimate options to create the optimal coffee for you. So countries like Japan, for example, highest Starbucks per head in the world, Japan and China. And they're very much on the optimizer side of perfectionism. And it's interesting. In Japan, as those of you who visited know, that there are so many Starbucks knockoffs around and very, very, extremely successful ones. So let's look at, say, self-esteem. Now, if you're selling things like beauty products, if you're selling things like any symbolic purchase, like a watch or fashion, or indeed a car, because we wear our cars as much as we wear fashion and watches. Self-esteem is everybody's right. Say people in gratifier cultures, and that's we can see a lot of that evidence of that in the United States, for example, amongst people of my generation. On the other hand, is self-esteem? Self-esteem is a challenge. It's always a problem. You need to work on yourself to be able to be proud of yourself. And you can see that if you do something very, very simple like conduct an image search. Brazil is a gratifier culture, and if you search for autoestima in images, you see lots of, love yourself, you're good, you don't have to change, it's all great. Finland, interestingly, what does self-esteem mean? It's always a problem. It's something that is a challenge for you. I can't do it. Those are the things, it's a task that you have to overcome. Thinking about one of the most perfectionist cultures on the planet, when we look at self-esteem in Japanese, jishonshin, we can see on the left-hand side that they are pretty positive words. Pride, dignity, self-assurance, confidence. As opposed to jishonshin in Japanese, conceit, pride, vanity, arrogance, superciliousness, self-esteem, egotism. And interestingly, if you look at the lexical proximity, what words come around those pictures of jishonshin? Jishonshin upsets harmony, says some. People with too much jishonshin have no sense of humor. And how do I get children to accept criticism if they have too much self-esteem? To many of us on this webinar today, that sounds a bit like anathema, but it is a legitimate cultural difference which is based on people who share the same instinctive emotional response. So let's look at perfectionism from the point of view of brand architecture. Havaianas is a fascinating brand to me. And again, Havaianas is not a client of mine, not yet a client if anyone's listening. But one of the things about Havaianas is that they make every kind of flip-flop. There's a bit of, beach bags. There's a bit of, sunglasses under the Havaianas brand, probably because of Luxottica, the Italian company that licenses all those brands. But basically, it's every kind of flip-flop that you can imagine. The white ones that I'm pointing at now are actually wedding flip-flops with a Swarovski crystal in them. You would think that you could branch out into bikinis or swimwear or board shorts or beach towels or umbrellas or heaven knows what else. But we are anchored in a gratifier culture, which is, yes, don't have to improve, don't have to change. People love us. We're going to stick to it. On the other hand, Sony, an astonishing company whom Reason Track constantly criticized for spreading itself too thin, that's what makes it successful. We look at all the brands and the sub-brands and things. The largest division of Sony is PlayStation, which only takes up about 28% of the entire company. And they go into all kinds of things, including content, Sony Pictures Entertainment, Sony Columbia, all kinds of brands. They move in and out of categories almost, constantly. They're always improving, always changing. And that's something that appeals in these perfectionistic optimizer cultures. And in fact, they're getting out of things, and Sony's getting out of television, for example, because they see the future is going to be just dumb screens. So all kinds of those brands are falling out, and they'll be inventing new ones and bringing more into the Sony stable. Let's think about Coke, and this is another Japanese example. If we're in our gratifier culture. And in this slide, gratifier is on the right. That's a traditional American Coke machine, which has 5 drinks in it. Six options, but 2 of which are Coca-Cola. All good, extremely successful model in so many of the gratifier cultures around the world. On the left, you see a Japanese Coke machine. Now, Coca-Cola sells over 50 brands in Japan. And inside every Coke machine, you have this array of brands from which to choose. And so diverse is Coke's range, I've actually seen in Japan a Coke machine that didn't have any actual Coke in it. So that change and constant development is something that's very important to our optimizer consumers, like Japanese consumers. What we can see in front of us, and I'm not going to make any judgments on this one for us, but I'm asking the question here. This is the new machine. This is the new 21st century Coke machine, which has a screen at the top. It's capable of mixing 135 possible drinks, which is the classic optimizer options. But there are 35 displayed, and you have to do a guided navigation to get into the drink that you ultimately decide is the optimal drink that you're interested in. Do we have 2 mixed signals here? We know our gratifier cultures prefer a simple choice. Our optimizer cultures prefer greater variety. Is this going to be successful? Is it not? We will certainly be watching that. And it shows up in how you present choice. Our gratifier cultures, I don't want to change. I know what I like. Don't mess with it. Take me to what I want as fast as possible. This is the website for Lexus USA. This is the website for Mercedes-Benz USA. This is the website for Mercedes-Benz Mexico. And what you can see is there are lots of drop-down menus and interstitials. These are the landing pages for the same brands, Mercedes and Lexus, in 2 of the optimizer countries. And we can see on the landing page, you get the maximum possible choice all at once, because I want to graze on these things. I want to see, if I'm an optimizer, what's going to be the optimum result for me. Am I missing out on something that could be even better? And that's very, very solid. This is another example, Sephora in Australia, which has a very short landing page and lots of divisions into guided navigation and collection. On the right is Sephora in China, and look at the choice on the landing page. I might also add, and this is something to note for a little while from now, look at the use of color, because that's also a cultural preference that can be measured, and it follows a number of other things, and that is what we call social fabric. Those of us who are familiar with cultural dimensions will know that this is a version of the classic collectivism, individualism. But when we think about it, it's much better to say, do we have a tight social fabric or a loose social fabric? Because that really tells us how consumers behave. If we say, okay, here's my brand, what does it do? I don't really care about who's it for, where it helps me fit into the social fabric. Whereas in a tight social context culture, like, say, for example, India or Nigeria, it's really, really important to say, yeah, is it for somebody like me? Who else chooses this product? As opposed to, say, for example, the UK, where it's not all that important, no matter what generation you're in. And it's interesting because this is where, say, for example, Japan, which has had a number of different scores on classic collectivism, individualism, in this model of consumer culture, Japan is very much more, yeah, what does it do? Tell me about it. High information demand. We look at how we deliver a message. In a loose social context, individualistic culture, we're very much tied to text. The words are the message. On the other hand, in a tight social context culture, a collective one, it's not just literally what the message says, often in text. Everything else, the context around it, tells you a lot. And that's why I wanted you to remember the business of color. This, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Our collective cultures on the left, tight social fabrics, our cultures are individualistic, loose social fabric cultures on the right. And the use of color on the left is really astonishing when you see the difference. I'll point at, say, for example, Singapore Airlines. Not just does it say, as the crew walks through the airport, that these people work for Singapore Airlines. Inside the cabin, each one of those different colors shows us what the rank is, where you fit into the social context, from the purser to the chief cabin attendant to the rank and file cabin attendants and such. And so color is one of those things which really helps us navigate and say how I want to respond. On the other hand, a uniform in what I would say the culture that I grew up in, a uniform is supposed to be uniform. And what you have to do is you have to look at the badge on the person in uniform to determine where exactly they fit in context. There's a difference for Virgin, because Virgin is deliberately countercultural. And at Alitalia, have a look at them. Colorful uniforms, fantastic. The different colors and the purple and the green. I don't think I need to remind any of us here Alitalia went broke. On the other hand, its replacement, ITA Airlines, much more in line with individualistic, more European cultures. And that goes back to our favorite subject of web navigation. In a tight social context culture, color is used for navigation. This is the website of the government of Nigeria. And you can follow 3 color paths so that you know that. On the other hand, government of the Netherlands relies particularly on text. Yes, there's a picture, all great. Have they spent a lot of time thinking about what picture they're going to have there? I don't think so. But the real information is carried in text below it. So if we look at social fabric again, do I trust an influencer? The influencer has to be competent, and relevant, but they don't have to be famous. On the other hand, we ask, are they famous in our tight social context culture? Because the tight social context culture absolutely cares about what the rest of the social fabric thinks of any influencer. And this is one of the tools that we use a great deal we use this tool a great deal in our work, where we talk about the influencer spectrum. And the first thing I want to say, and it's very important to say, that if you have a celebrity, it actually kind of works everywhere in some way, because celebrities, you can identify them, they're memorable, they attract attention. That aids mental availability, if we want to use Ehrenberg Bass terminology. But how emotionally available are they? That depends on culture. So if we're in our individualistic, loose social fabric kind of culture, there's less need for popularity. Somebody just has to be relevant to what they're saying. On the other hand, in tight social fabric, so-called collective or we cultures, there's a much greater need for fame and popularity, because to be popular is to be powerful. And to be powerful is, I'm going to give you a powerful result whenever you buy the product. So that's very much more that this has been this has been known a long time, is that those celebrity influencers are much more prevalent in collective, and to use another dimension that we often use in intercultural management, high power distance, hierarchical cultures. So where do we see the spectrum panning out? Because there are cultures in the middle, and there are more of them, as we will see in a moment. If you want to have credibility, be famous. How many other people trust them? Then I can trust them too. In a very highly individualistic culture, yeah, there's somebody with the same problem that I have. A user testimonial is very powerful. But in the middle, where you have to say, yeah, I want them to be kind of famous and I want them to be kind of, I want them to know what they're talking about or have some kind of relevance. That's where influencer culture exploding in the second quarter of the 21st century comes in. And this spectrum here is one of the tools that we use. I'll start at the left-hand side and say, where is just being famous enough? Well, India is one place, and Airbnb making content for India shows Saif Ali Khan and Kareena Kapoor. No, and I think many of those who are familiar with Indian culture will say these are the, A plus listers of the A list. And they simply show a film of the two of them taking a house in Windsor and just having a nice time. Of course, everybody in India knows the context is Saif Ali Khan, apart from being an actor, is also, his family also owns hotels. So there's a bit of context that everybody knows that's not stated explicitly. But they don't actually pitch anything. That would lower their status. They don't say, try Airbnb now. And it's the same thing with his wife, Kareena Kapoor, who's been the face of Lux for a very long time. She's a relevant user, but she doesn't actually say, "Oh, look, Lux does wonders for my skin." She lends her glamour and her authority to it. Then we start to get into the middle, and here we start Mr. Bags in China, who is a tech entrepreneur who decided to start a website recommending bags. And as his influence grew, he has no influence in handbags, leather goods, accessories, or anything like that. But he sort of became famous for being famous in this relevant way. Doesn't particularly have any expertise, but he has relevance as an influencer. Then we say, okay, is there such a thing as a famous expert? And here we start getting into more loose social context, individualistic cultures. So Gordon Ramsay, for example, or Jamie Oliver are the classic relevant and expert pitch people, and they directly pitch to the camera. They don't just come in and say, in this case, Gordon Ramsay appears for Walker's Chips, but he actually talks about it and tells the audience what it is. If you have somebody who's not necessarily an expert but is highly relevant, for example, Jane Fonda and L'Oreal's anti-aging product, that she also gives a pitch. She says, "This is what I do. This is what it does for my skin," which, by the way, Kareena Kapoor doesn't do for Lux. Then, and since I live in Germany, this is kind of a national in-joke. The person in a white lab coat doing a pitch can be an anonymous scientist with some kind of credentials. And Neutrogena uses their chief scientist, Dr. Gudrun. And I quite honestly say, yeah, Dr. Gudrun, yeah, I'd never heard of her, but oh, she's the chief scientist for Neutrogena. Important. And finally, if we think back to older Americans and we think about the 2014 campaign for Esurance, where they bought an ad just after the Super Bowl finished, and they had this kind of anonymous guy who said, "You don't know me. I just want to tell you that we didn't spend all this money on a Super Bowl ad so we can give you a cheaper product." All good, but we now know the guy whom they chose as John Krasinski. But in 2014, the reason why he got cast was because he wasn't anybody special, and you just focused on the message. And that's extraordinary when you start thinking about how culture, this one cultural measure, affects so much about what kind of influencer you use. And finally, when we talk about culture, culture changes. And we hinted at that in the presentation here when we looked at the generation change for the UK. And that's important because if you think about what makes people share the same emotion, the world you're born into and when you have your formative experiences and where you have them is going to be very important. So here, I'm going back to me. I am here. That's me. I'm a baby boomer, a young baby boomer, of course. But amongst this generation, the idea of having an immediate reward was very telling. My elders, the hippie boomers, said, "Do it now. If it feels good, do it." And a lot of the world was very much like that, whether they were collective or individualist. Let's now look at Generation Z and millennials. That's Generation Z. Extraordinarily shocking difference. And that's the one thing that we can say about Generation Z, which is the most dramatic change, is that they have become these long-term optimizers. They're more perfectionistic, as opposed to people of my background, my cultural cohort is all about, oh yeah, I want it now. It doesn't have to be perfect. And that's interesting. If we look at millennials, I've noted where millennials and Gen Z differ here. They tend to be more individualistic. Does that make them more, oh, I don't want to say it, selfish? Well, let's not do that. But in general, millennials, where there is a difference, they're more individualistic. Uh, and that's important. Now, if we think about our perfectionists, and they tend to be on the individualistic side. I can't. I don't get any reassurance for being perfect or acceptable or anything. That pressure to constantly improve incrementally every day, everything you do, there's probably going to be something you can do a little bit better. It's no wonder there is an epidemic of anxiety around the world, and theorists like Jonathan Haidt, who wrote the book The Anxious Generation, put this down. Anxiety is about social media comparison for women and gaming for men. It increases anxiety. Rather, I would say that's a symptom, not a cause, that it can be traced back to the fact of this perfectionism, which has been inculcated into these generations in many parts of the world. Not everywhere in the world, by the way, I'll point out there's a great discussion to have about that. But how many of us, if you have grown up in these kinds of cultures, particularly, say, if you're an American Gen Z or millennial, have you not heard something from your parents that runs something like this? Um, I see you have an extra hour on Thursdays between soccer practice and choir. Why don't you take up another extracurricular? It's going to look good on your college application. And that pressure to be constantly improving is something which has instilled that perfectionism. And in fact, over the course of the pandemic, which also forced us to think, oh, yeah, we've got to start worrying about the future. The score for this long-term orientation, the perfectionism, has increased in the United States by 6 points, which is very, very radical in that. So that really tells us, again, understanding culture and what is behind the common emotions that we share as groups, as people we belong to. That's vitally important to understand. And it's because it gives us insights like this. For boomers like me, often say, yeah, what are these young people? I can't figure them out. Well, in fact, and I owe this insight to my good friend demographer Bradley Sherman, for boomers, Gen Z are not young people nowadays. They are your parents. You think about what the influences that made my parents who they were. And they were, of course, two world wars, depressions, constant threats, anxiety dominated their lives. Uh, they believed in fairness because, the Great Depression, which was so formative on them, showed a lot about social justice. So they were a bit more collective, more community oriented, and they focused on the long-term future because war, depression, all of that gave them an outlook like tomorrow. I believe in progress. Tomorrow is going to be a better day. And there was a lot more talk about how wonderful the future was going to be amongst my parents' generation than there is amongst, my generation. So you can see how important all of these measures, being able to put a number on how cultures, how emotional cohorts differ from each other, really unlocks a huge number of insights. And with that, Egbert can tell us among those things that we can do with it.
Thank you, Marty. So let's move back or forward a generation. I don't know how to talk about that because I am a millennial, so I'm not your parents' generation, Marty. I'm the one that came after you, an old millennial. Jokes aside, I think that today has probably given all of us in the audience a reflection on how cultural metrics can help us better make sense. For example, about market performance diagnostics. Sometimes you get results back and you're wondering, how could this be? Our advice is look into cultural coding because that is more often than not where you will find explanations that can provide better insights. We just finished up talking about generations and subcultures and how those impact the messaging that we use, the frequency that we use, potentially the heroes that we use. We spoke about what are the channels that we want to leverage. Can we use influencers? And if we use influencers, should they know or have a connection to that what we're trying to sell? We spoke to some extent on brand architecture. There is so much more to discover, understanding how, where, and when culture influences successful marketing, branding, communication, and not just going into the market, but also looking within your own marketing team to understand, are we perhaps biased in the way we think about our own brand? So, closing off for today, we're going to have about, give or take, 10 minutes for Q&A. And we'll do this basically in the way first come, first serve. So please do feel free to type your message in the chat, and then either Marty or myself will answer the respective question. We will be sharing, as said, the recording with you, and we very much look forward to opening up an individual discussion with you post today's webinar. So in the chat, our team will also put the contact email address that you can reach out to if you want to have a separate deep dive with either one of us at the Culture Factor Group with regards to your brand, your marketing, your communication. But on that note, I think we can stop sharing our screen and we open up for Q&A amongst those of us present here. Feel free to either type it in the chat, or if you want to verbalize your question, comment, please raise your digital hand so that we can give space to your question and or comment. And as we're many of us, I can unfortunately not see all physical hands. So if you have a question, please raise your digital hand or put it in the chat. I have a first personal question here, Marty, in my chat. What has been the most impactful marketing campaign that you have worked on using this new knowledge? Because I believe you mentioned that this is also something that you grew into over the years.
Yeah. One of the things that I can say, well, the thing is that it would be difficult to select one or more of them because in every way, there are some things that are just kind of ahas, and everyone goes, oh, hang on, why? Now that makes sense. Some of the campaigns that I have used cultural knowledge on, I used to be the global planning director on Mercedes-Benz for BBDO for many years. and understanding the way in which, the notion of immediate gratification for luxury cars was very, very important, and it made a difference. I can't take complete credit for the brand architecture, but for the brand architecture insight. But it was something that was extraordinarily important when you recognize cultural shifts. When I was working in Japan, KitKat, we were there you know, at the kickoff of the whole KitKat phenomenon, and that was extraordinarily important. But even now, one of our major clients is Unilever Beauty and Wellness, and the number of things, the notion about perfectionism, self-esteem, and self-acceptance. There are so many of those, so many insights that come through there that it's vitally, that they've just seen a step change in their business, a step change in particular in their concept pre-testing.
Thanks. Marty, I have another question here, and I can elaborate on that as well, post your view. How do you train your marketing team in particular, or your brand team, to spot cultural risk slash opportunity?
Yeah. One of the things that I would say, and Egbert, I'm sure that you would say this too, is how do you train? You come to the culture factor, right?
I'm glad that we instilled the sales sense there. Um, Without jokes, I think the first answer to that question is start by understanding your team. We might share passports, but what does a passport really say? Nowadays, with a world where global mobility is more and more becoming the norm, especially in international jobs, how much time have you allocated to really understand your team? And not from the individual perspective, but really from the collective perspective. That would be one of my strongest recommendations for any international team. Forget individual profiles, look at what the individual profiles collectively mean. And then you know much better to see, okay, where do we have blind spots, and where might we therefore need to hire an external? Or in case you have an actual good amount of diversity present inside a team, how do you use the diversity? Because having it is useless if you do not use it.
Yeah. And Egbert, I'll build on that if I may.
Yep.
One of the things that we can see so many times that the assumptions that marketers make instinctively are based on where classic marketing tools come from. That is, they're a very individualistic culture. Most marketing theories like positioning, for example, originated in the United States amongst a certain generation. And I have seen when we have done exactly what Egbert is talking about, I've seen inside organizations that there is so much, shared emotional response that, a company has a culture just like a country does. And in large multinational marketers, that tends to be an individualistic culture. That tends to be to some degree, a long-term optimizer perfectionist culture. That tends to be very low context culture, individualistic. That is, focus on the message, but you kind of ignore the emotional geography that the customer walks through.
Yeah.
So I don't just echo Egbert in saying that you should measure it, but in the short term, you can actually say, watch out for bringing too much kind of historical marketing baggage, which is rooted in, individualistic, loose social context cultures. And that's only about 35–40% of the world's consumer population. And further, even those in those individualistic cultures are becoming more what we would call collective, more aware of the social context. So think about the kind of people, the kind of culture that just working in marketing brings into your organization.
And I think jumping on that, I think you already answered now one of the other questions with regards to what are the typical challenges that multinationals have. And I think you listed now quite a few. So it is sometimes quite present inside organizations, multinationals in particular, to go with a standardized approach, one size fits all. There is one question here, Marty, in the chat in terms of to which extent do you feel that small versus big organizations can use these insights? Is this a topic that only big organizations have the budget for? Or would you argue that also smaller organizations can actually leverage this knowledge because the internet basically means they can reach the world?
Yeah, the you will reach the world potentially on the internet. But one of the things that you're not going to do is you're not going to reach the world uniformly. There will be places that will, because online, for example, we're subject to algorithms. There are going to be some places where you get that rush of emotional connection, which is then going to accelerate, right? So the algorithm is going to disproportionately skew the recipients of your message to a particular emotional cohort. So that becomes actually more important for smaller organizations
Yeah.
because you have to be more careful to have the right kind of message for the emotional cohort you want. Inside the organization, is there greater diversity in a small organization maybe than there is in a large one? Because in the large one, the differences get evened out. That's a case by case basis.
And I think
The
that maybe jumping on that, it's part of this reflection as well, that in order for any marketeer or marketing team to really understand the audience that they're approaching, start with yourself. Really understand who are we as a team? How do we connect to this topic? How does it influence the choices that we make? And that also can be used to get budget from a centralized headquarters. If you can clarify that, hey, our HQ team is very different from our local team, and that means they simply can't see certain things, data will help to drive a better discussion. Now, looking at the time, we have 2 minutes left. I'm going to pick one final question here from the chat, Marty. As you and me have spoken a lot about this, you've seen the reality on the marketing and communication end. I've seen the reality in employability end, which is we indicated changes in culture between the generations. And the question is, does this apply only in this topic of marketing, or do we see this as well in society at large? In other words, are we able to drive a discussion that gives better space to, I would call, a more localized approach to culture, and not one country score summarizes everything?
Yeah, uh, it's an important question, and understanding diversity within a culture is important. Particularly if you look at a culture like the United States, right? The United States is not a culture. It's a constellation of subcultures which work together. And I'm not going to make any comments about whether they're working together better or worse, I think. But if we look at how national cultures change in general, yeah, cultures can change, particularly traumatic experiences, right? You have a pandemic and cultures shift. Those places where the pandemic was, more severe, change to this long-term orientation much more quickly. For example, if you have a population which has undergone economic trauma, that's going to affect cultures. It's going to make them more, what we'll call collective, more aware of social context and things.
Yeah.
And within any of those countries, each of these things is going to affect people in a disproportionate way. If economic trauma doesn't affect everybody within a country the same way. So we have to look at that. And we did some very interesting work for Unilever about that, about what the different people and the different subgroups of people within cultures, how they responded to the economic privation of the pandemic. We called it the
The cash
cash
that
strapped
consumer. Yeah.
study.
Yeah, and I think definitely like echoing that, if you look at work life, different generations have different emotional needs when it comes to what it means to be a successful employee, what it means in terms of the guidance they need from their colleagues and their superiors. So I think, Marty, we have plenty of content to continue talking. However, our webinars tend to stick to timing. We started at precisely 1 hour ago. That means that for today, I would very much, Marty, like to thank you for your very insightful walkthrough of just the top layer, I would argue. I'd like to thank the audience for all the very active questioning. Great. Thank you so much. Do reach out to us if you want to engage in further discussions, scoping of assignments within your teams, your organization. Stay tuned for whatever comes next in our newsletter on our website. We will come back to you with the recording, and we thank you once more for spending your time with us. Have a very nice continuation of your day, and see you in the future. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you.